It's hard to imagine the president in an orange jumpsuit for a lot of different reasons, some aesthetic, some more substantive. But if you want to understand what happened today with the utter chaos in Washington, brought about in that Senate committee room by both protesters and Senate Democrats trying to delay or stop this particular president from making a nomination to the Supreme Court right now, it's worth being cognizant of the fact that this president really is in a legal situation unlike any other president who was in the position to be nominating somebody to the Supreme Court. The orange jumpsuit concern is real. I mean, the president's own legal jeopardy is barreling toward a finale that will almost assuredly rocket through the federal courts and thereby almost assuredly get to the Supreme Court. This president is an unindicted co-conspirator in a federal case that has been brought against his personal lawyer and has already resulted in 8 guilty felony pleas. That same longtime personal lawyer swore in open court, under oath, that it was the president himself who ordered him to commit multiple felonies during the course of the presidential campaign. The president's first national security advisor, his deputy campaign chair, a campaign foreign policy advisor have all pled guilty already to federal felony charges in conjunction with this investigation. We're awaiting a sentencing at the end of this week for the campaign foreign policy advisor who has pled guilty. The jury selection process started literally today for a second federal jury that is going to hear additional felony charges against the president's campaign chair, who was already just found guilty on 8 felony counts and who's about to go on trial for another 7 felony counts. The president's White House counsel has reportedly given over 30 hours of interviews to the special counsel, and he's just announced that he's leaving the administration. The CFO of the president's business, an executive who's been with the president for decades and who worked for the president's father before him, the executive who has apparently authorized every single payment that ever went through the president's business or charitable foundation, the executive who reportedly filled out at least some of the president's tax returns, he has now been granted immunity by federal prosecutors in exchange for his cooperation in their inquiries. As has the head of the National Enquirer, supermarket tabloid, which prosecutors say participated in some of the president's illegal hush money schemes, which have now been charged as federal campaign finance felonies in the Southern District of New York. Also granted immunity, this convicted pedophile, who most recently was the business partner of a major Trump donor and a high-ranking Republican Party official who is now reportedly under investigation by the Public Integrity Section at the U.S. Justice Department for influence peddling. A federal grand jury in Washington this week is continuing to hear testimony that appears to be connected to the president's longtime political consultant, Roger Stone, who is now pleading publicly for help paying his legal bills because he says he's quite sure that he's the next one to be indicted and soon. Yeah, so it's not like the president has anything to worry about legally, right? I mean, no chance anything related to this president is going to end up like in the courts anytime soon, right? The New York Times reports tonight that the special counsel's office is now negotiating in writing with the president's current legal team about the manner in which they expect to be taking testimony from the president himself in this scandal. And so, yeah, you might expect a little controversy, a little turbulence when a president personally facing this amount of legal jeopardy tries to install, in this context, a new justice on the Supreme Court.
I believe you've repeatedly and enthusiastically embraced an interpretation of presidential power so expansive it could result in a dangerously unaccountable president at the very time when we are most in need of checks and balances.
You are the nominee of President Donald John Trump. This is a president who's shown us consistently that he is contemptuous of the rule of law. And it's that president who's decided you are his man.
You've taken the unorthodox position that presidents should not be burdened with a criminal or civil investigation while in office. This is now we have a president who has declared in the last 24 hours that the Department of Justice shouldn't prosecute Republicans. You know, it's Alice in Wonderland. And I find it difficult to imagine that your views on this subject escape the attention of President Trump, who seems increasingly fixated on his own ballooning legal jeopardy.
what Senator Leahy is talking about there when he says the unorthodox positions of Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh, that presidents shouldn't be burdened with a criminal or civil investigation while in office. What he's saying there is true about Brett Kavanaugh. I mean, Republicans in the Senate have tried to create an image of Judge Kavanaugh as a sort of generic, normal conservative pick for the Supreme Court. But Brett Kavanaugh does swing really, really wide on, of course, the purely hypothetical issue of a president someday, who knows, maybe somehow finding himself or herself in legal jeopardy. He swings really wide on that issue. He does not come across as a cookie-cutter conservative Republican nominee on that issue in particular. On that one, he's an outlier. Even among conservatives, Brett Kavanaugh writing in 2009, quote, "We should not burden a sitting president with civil suits, criminal investigations, or criminal prosecutions. The president's job is difficult enough as it is. The country loses when the president's focus is distracted by the burdens of civil litigation or criminal investigation and possible prosecution." Quote, "Even the lesser burdens of a criminal investigation, including preparing for questioning by criminal investigators, are time-consuming and distracting. Like civil suits, criminal investigations take the president's focus away from his or her responsibilities to the people. And a president who is concerned about an ongoing criminal investigation is almost inevitably going to do a worse job as president." Quote, "The indictment and trial of a sitting president would cripple the federal government. Such an outcome would ill serve the public interest." President Trump's Supreme Court nominee, yes, is expected to be a decisive vote to make abortion illegal, at least in large swaths of the country, by overturning Roe versus Wade. Brett Kavanaugh is expected to be a decisive vote to remove limits on secret money in political campaigns. He's expected to be a potentially decisive vote on a number of issues of racial justice, including his enthusiastic hostility to affirmative action and the Voting Rights Act, and I could keep going. But you know, the basic idea here is clear, and Republicans see all of those things as the plus side for Brett Kavanaugh. That's why they want to confirm him. But you know what? There's a million judges like that they could have picked. A million judges who have all those same positions on those issues, who would actually be more confirmable than Brett Kavanaugh for this seat on the Supreme Court. There's a million conservative Republican judges out there who don't have gazillions of pages of documents from their 5 years serving in the George W. Bush White House dealing with the most controversial issues of that administration. Documents which Republicans will now have to bend over backwards to conceal from scrutiny, thus breaking all their own precedents about how Supreme Court nominees are reviewed. The top Republican in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, is said to have warned the White House explicitly against picking Kavanaugh because he might be difficult to confirm, specifically because of his super long paper trail that Republicans didn't know how they would contend with. Kavanaugh is not the easiest pick for them. He was first nominated to a federal judgeship in 2003. It took the George W. Bush White House 3 freaking years to get him confirmed because he was seen as so controversial and so partisan. And then when he was finally confirmed, there's strong evidence that he misled the Senate at his confirmation hearings and told them something that was not true when they were trying to confirm him for that last job. Republicans could have chosen a gazillion different Brett Kavanaugh-type judges when it comes to policy issues, on which we are quite sure that Brett Kavanaugh will vote as a hardline, uncompromising right-wing justice. But out of all the judges this president could have picked, this president picked the one, the only judge we know of to have been on the president's supposed list of contenders, who, for example, had gone out of his way in a public setting to say that the Supreme Court's unanimous ruling in U.S. v. Nixon might have been wrongly decided. The only nominee who has sketched out a truly unique, even to the point of being strange, view of a president's susceptibility to serious criminal investigations. Brett Kavanaugh is the only one out there that we know who says a president shouldn't even be questioned, let alone indicted or prosecuted. And so, yes, it is a little on the nose that this particular nominee was chosen by a president who is himself the subject of serious criminal investigation right now, while Kavanaugh's confirmation proceedings are underway. And now now the senators from the president's party appear ready to pull out all the stops to get this nominee confirmed before the midterm elections in November that will decide the control of Congress. The president signaled in an interview with Bloomberg News last week that as soon as the midterm elections are over, he will move to fire the Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. after the midterm election. We also know from a tape we obtained of Congressman Devin Nunes from the Intelligence Committee and Kathy McMorris Rodgers, who's in the House Republican leadership. We know from the tape we obtained of them speaking at a Republican fundraiser that the House Republican plan after the midterm elections is also to impeach and try to remove from office the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, who directly oversees the Mueller investigation. And he will continue to oversee that investigation unless and until Attorney General Jeff Sessions is replaced in office, which the president says will happen right after the midterms. In order to rush through Kavanaugh's confirmation before the midterm elections, before the midterm elections take place and the White House and Republicans in Congress thereafter make those promised moves to try to throttle the Russia investigation, Republicans in the Senate are trying to ram through this confirmation as quickly as possible. And part of the way they are doing that is by just not allowing a review of Kavanaugh's record. If you saw any of the hearing today, you saw Democrats complaining about not having the paperwork, right? How Brett Kavanaugh's records are being withheld from the committee. They're being withheld from the public. It's an unprecedented way to proceed with the Supreme Court nomination, to not have documents from the nominees' time in public service reviewed by the National Archives and made available to the committee and to the public so they can vet the nomination. I mean, rather than allow the National Archives to review and release Brett Kavanaugh's records on the occasion of his confirmation hearings, Republicans instead, they're really trying to get away with this brand new system they have MacGyvered up for considering Brett Kavanaugh's paper trail as fast as possible, but definitely before the election. This thing that they have invented, this system they have invented for reviewing Kavanaugh's record, the Republican plan, which is why Democrats went so nuts today. The Republican plan really does seem to be that Kavanaugh's records will just be reviewed by an old friend of his, a fellow Republican activist lawyer from the Bush administration, a man named Bill Burke, who also at the same time is representing Steve Bannon, former White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, and outgoing White House counsel Don McGahn in the Russia investigation. So Bill Burke is representing three crucial Trump-related witnesses in the Russia investigation. And simultaneously, he personally is serving as the gatekeeper on what documents from Brett Kavanaugh's past will be allowed to be seen by the committee and by the Senate before Kavanaugh is put on the Supreme Court. And so, no, things did not look normal today at this committee hearing in Washington. And 70 people were arrested at this hearing today. And they couldn't get 30 seconds into this hearing today before it all started to fall apart, and it was hours delayed. And we've never seen a confirmation hearing quite like this, but there's a reason for that. There's a reason for that. We've never had a nominee like this. It's clear they went out of their way to find this particular nominee, and he's trying, and the president is attempting to put him on the court at a time that the president's own legal jeopardy sets this nomination apart from any other one in U.S. history. So there's a reason why things are going a little nuts today. We've got more ahead tonight, including my interview with John Kerry. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.